Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will first update on our COVID-19 status, and in light of the testimony, let me just emphasize once again that we continue to be advised by our own experts. We have a group that meets regularly to give us guidance. That includes MD participation, it includes nurse participation, it includes public health participation, and it reviews federal mandates, state mandates, and the CDC guidance in its entirety. And our program requirements are all based on that as advised by our own internal highly qualified experts. We are continuing to press on with the vaccination requirement for students and employees. Students need to be vaccinated to register for in-person classes at any of our UH campuses. Other students who choose not to be vaccinated may take online courses, or they may have options of other institutions, although vaccine mandates are increasingly common. We also have a vaccine mandate for employees that we've publicized quite widely. We're now sending weekly reminders to employees for whom we do not yet have records of vaccination. As one of the testifiers noted, we also have a requirement from the federal government as a contractor to the federal government that we implement vaccine mandates as well. Vice Presidents Govea and LaCroix, Vice President LaCroix works particularly with UPA, but together they are working with our unions. We're finalizing our consultations on two policies. One is the mandatory vaccination policy for employees. The other is a telework policy. So we have had a telework program in place since mid-2020, and it was an interim COVID-19 telework policy while we were under assorted state and county orders asking us to stay home to the extent possible. As that begins to expire, one of the many lessons we have learned is that many of our employees can do their work without being in the office, sometimes perhaps full-time, mostly part-time. And we do want to implement a non-COVID related telework policy that will provide appropriate mechanisms to allow employees to work from home and ensure that their supervisors are able to manage to get the work of the university done. We are optimistic that both of these policies will be in place for the beginning of the calendar year. For our spring planning, it's pretty clear to all of us that returning to normal in 2022 is not a return to the past. All of our campuses will have much more in-person instruction, but I need to note that we were not 100% in person before COVID, and we will not be 100% in person after. There are a number of reasons for this. We are continuing to develop more online programs. Some of you may have seen the news announced, I think, this week about a new online Masters of Public Health from UH Manoa. That's designed to meet workforce needs. We expect primarily a working adult enrollment in a program like that, and online works better for them. Many of our even traditional students are expressing strong preferences for some online courses. It doesn't mean they're signing up for an all online schedule, but we are finding that the online sections that we are offering often are filling up faster than our in-person courses. So we are adapting to student demand as we need to. Locally and nationally, this is an ongoing trend. The future is not in-person or online, it is both, and finding the right mix that addresses the needs of our students will be key. We will also see both national data and local data that even our traditional students, when they take online courses, if they don't take too many online courses, that they actually do better and they persist more and their graduation statistics are excellent. So those are the things we are moving forward to our new future. With our federal resources, we invested heavily in classroom technology throughout the system. Some campuses have called the technology high flex. That's a national term. We also sometimes use the term here and there. And the idea is that from a classroom equipped with cameras and screens, a faculty member can teach from that classroom to students in person, as well as students who may be Zooming in from home. And students can actually shift locations throughout the course of the semester in those classes. And it's a new modality for us that we're pretty interested in exploring how that works to help us meet student need. Lastly, on this point, I want to mention that there's incredible variability across our campuses and programs. For example, UH West Oahu had 45% of its classes online before the pandemic, and that's their approach to serving both neighbor island students with bachelor's degrees. Also, they have an older and more working profile of their students than many of our other campuses. At the same time, Manoa is now looking like about 80% of its classes with some in-person component, and some of its schools actually are pretty close to 100%, and you can imagine those are disciplines like engineering, architecture, that have a much more hands-on profile. So there's no simple answer except that we will be much more in person, and we are utilizing the technologies and the lessons available to try and craft our offerings to meet the needs of our students throughout the state. I did get a question from a regent about athletics attendance in light of COVID as well. It has been an extraordinary period of time over, I think, the last 6 weeks or so. We have shifted from having no fans in our venues, and our venues include the new Ching Field, the Stan Sheriff Center, and I do not want to overlook our women's soccer team and their outdoor venue as well. We've gone from no fans to partial fans, and now we are at a condition of full seating. This becomes quite a challenge for our athletic department to ticket, including people who bought tickets that those seats may not have been available, and trying to move people around. We also are not yet allowed concessions at any of our venues other than water. I did get a report one day that we had sold 24 bottles of water by halftime at a football game. So that has not been a big seller relative to other beverages that our fans are accustomed to enjoying at our sporting events. We are now stable at full seating. And again, I'll emphasize, we have a 100% vaccination requirement. We do not permit exemptions for attendance at athletic events. Our protocols are working well. If you can imagine, it's not necessarily that easy to get thousands of people into a venue, checking their Loomis site and or vaccination cards. But we've had a pretty good test of those things. We do find that the lack of concessions is still a bit of a challenge. Our fans do appreciate food and beverage at sporting events, but we expect to be building up. We have not yet had a sellout at anything. I do not believe we are sold out for our last home football game, which will be Saturday. Our most competitively interesting volleyball match will interestingly be the last match of the season when our women's volleyball team takes on UC Santa Barbara. We are the two top teams in our Big West Athletic Conference. So if we are to have a sellout, that would likely be the game, which is a sellout, and we will absolutely find out if our protocols work. Secondly, I want to provide an update on the SCR 201 task force. I mentioned this last month. This was a joint resolution by both legislative chambers. This is an unusual task force convened by the executive director of UPA and the UH president, and chaired by the chair of the Board of Regents. We had just begun to meet when I last updated you, and the group continues to meet weekly under the extraordinary leadership of Chairman Moore. We have spent our first 5 meetings primarily looking at how to gather the data that is both called for in the resolution and also will inform our ultimate recommendations. We now have a public website up, and we are posting meeting notes as we complete them and review them. The Chair Moore, and some members of the task force, including Regent Wilson, thank you, myself, and sometimes Executive Director Christian Fern from UPA, have been meeting with faculty groups. We are trying very hard to gather input from them before we issue any recommendations to see what input they may have. So far, we have met with the complete Manoa Faculty Senate. That was yesterday. We met with the Manoa Senate Executive Committee earlier this week, and we'll be meeting tomorrow with the All-Campus Council of Faculty Senate Chairs. I will just say, as was evident at the last board meeting, where I think we had 600 pages of testimony, none of which was in support of the report of the tenure pig. There were a lot of concerns among our faculty, and there are misgivings about anything in that neighborhood. So we are hoping we can get suggestions for improvement that we can bake into our report before we start drafting any recommendations. I'll just say that one of our observations is that while the resolution ultimately asks for proposed amendments to our existing tenure system and compensation structures, we are finding, and the tenure pig also noted this, that many of the ways we are unlike our peers are really about our classification system rather than the way tenure is actually administered here. Our goal is to meet the deadline of having a report by the end of the calendar year. That's obviously presents some challenges with consultation processes, so we will need to be working through that in our next meetings. I would also like to update on legislative inquiries. We've had a very busy off-season this year. I'm not exactly sure why, but we continue to receive regular inquiries from the Senate Higher Education Committee, its chair, its members. So far, UH and RCUH have provided what appears to be well over 5,000 pages in response to their queries. A lot of that has been detailed information on construction projects and contracts. Most recently, the new life science building at Manoa, and also the federally funded PICO renovation at UH West Oahu. We currently have responses pending to them regarding employees who have worked from outside the state. In particular, anyone who has worked for a month or more at any time in the last 4 years. That one's a bit of a challenge because that's not something we currently capture in our information systems. And we also have an inquiry regarding enrollment management and the services of the national consultant that we've utilized, and in particular, as that applies at UH West Oahu also. Next, I'd like to comment on the decadal survey that came up in testimony earlier today. This month, the National Academies of Science did release what is known as the Decadal Survey on Astronomy and Astrophysics, or Astro 2020, even though it's 2022. As the name suggests, this is once every 10 years report that identifies priorities for the nation in astronomy and astrophysics. They began with the questions that are important to the field. And I'll just take it from Physics World because they summarized it very nicely. 3 priorities. One is to identify and characterize Earth-like planets outside the solar system with the goal of imaging potentially habitable worlds. Second goal, high priority goal, is to probe the nature of black holes and neutron stars. And the third priority is to understand what happened in the earliest moments of the universe and improve our understanding of the origins and evolution of galaxies. So using those priority questions, they identified the highest priority projects. I'll just mention 3 aspects of the report that I think are most relevant to Hawaii. One, as noted in testimony, the highest priority for ground-based astronomy was something called the U.S. Extremely Large Telescope Program, or sometimes it's just called ELT. And the ELT program brings together TMT in the Northern Hemisphere, as well as something called the Giant Magellan Telescope in the Southern Hemisphere. And the idea is that these two very large telescopes will work together to provide information about the universe from both perspectives. The second priority I want to mention, it was a little bit farther down, and it is also farther out in time, is a project called the Next Generation Very Large Array, or NGVLA. This would be a successor to an aging VLBA program, and that's the Very Long Baseline Array. And the reason that's important to us is that VLBA is one of the telescopes just off the summit of Mauna Kea, but very high up there. We are important within this global array because of our location, 2,500 miles from pretty much anywhere else. What is interesting about this particular technology, this is radio astronomy, is that these facilities do not require the altitude of Mauna Kea. So this is a great opportunity for us to remove something from Mauna Kea and still achieve excellent scientific outcomes elsewhere in Hawaii. So we are working with NRAO. I plan to go to Washington, D.C. in the weeks to come, and I will meet with the NSF director about some ideas we have to actually reduce astronomy footprint on Mauna Kea, while increasing our scientific capacity and contribution to human knowledge within the state. The third thing I want to mention is something that was, I believe, first time and was also noted in the testimony this morning. Astro 2020, I believe for the first time, explicitly recognizes the concerns of many Native Hawaiians regarding astronomy and TMT in particular on Mauna Kea. And I believe that will be an influence on the work of the federal government moving forward. And more broadly, Astro 2020 acknowledges a problematic lack of diversity within the astronomy and astrophysics community and urges that the profession take action. So while not national policy, these decadal surveys, in this case Astro 2020, are traditionally given great weight by Congress and by the National Science Foundation. So more to come on how this plays out. Again, the report is just about 2 weeks old now. Sticking in the area of federal happenings, I was asked to highlight what's going on in Washington, D.C. and its impact on the University of Hawaii. So I will mention 3 sets of legislation that are important to us. First is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's the one that was signed by President Biden on Monday. It was a bipartisan bill, caught up in a fair amount of political drama that I won't say much about, but it does provide $1.2 trillion over 8 years for infrastructure. Most of that is around highways, bridges, public transit, airports, ports, water, clean energy, grids, electric vehicles, broadband, and community resilience. Most of this doesn't directly affect the university or higher education. Much of that is in the Build Back Better Act that I'll mention next. But I do want to highlight that in all of these areas, transportation, energy, water, electric vehicles, UH does expect to compete, and we expect to compete well for research dollars in these areas. So there's a lot of opportunity for us, and there's some specific language in some sections that will help us competitively. For example, we work hard with our congressional delegation to try to get notice of the special needs, for example, of non-contiguous states and the needs of minority populations. I want to highlight within this, though, and I've mentioned before, There is $65 billion for broadband. This is mostly going out to the states, some competitive and some formulaic. UH has been identified as the lead agency for the state of Hawaii. This is really a generational opportunity for our islands and our students statewide. So while it is not focused on UH and our needs, we have been asked to lead based on our experience and expertise. And this program will bring in hundreds of millions of dollars for Hawaii. And Vice President Yoshimi is on point, and I'm staying engaged as well because I can't help myself. The second one is the Build Back Better Act. This is the currently a Democratic Party only budget reconciliation proposal, sometimes referred to as the soft infrastructure package. This week, as pretty much every week for the last 5 or 6 weeks, maybe it will get voted on in the House this week. The party is not aligned on how big it should be or what should be in it, but the next step will probably be the House passing this bill. Then it will go over to the Senate, which will revise it to ensure that they can keep all 50 Democratic votes along with the Vice President breaking an expected tie as the 51st vote. You can read a lot about this bill generally, so I'm just going to say a little bit about how the current language, which is the November 3rd House Manager's version of the bill, how that will affect higher education. I will say we have reestablished what has been a traditional partnership between Hawaii and Alaska. So I've sent in a number of letters with my counterpart, the president of the University of Alaska, both to our congressional delegations, but also to the committees of jurisdiction and congressional leadership in both chambers. Just to quickly summarize, we think we have a good opportunity for facilities help for our agricultural research stations. I'll just say these are in terrible conditions. A few years ago, Regents had an opportunity to view some of these on Hawaii Island. A significant portion of our deferred maintenance backlog that we report on is actually in these agricultural research stations around the islands. The provisions for free community college have been dropped, but we do see likelihood of a significant increase in the maximum Pell Grant, which will assist our students who need financial help the most. That's the federal government's premier financial aid for students in need. We think there's a likelihood of support for increased investments in teacher preparation and language teachers in Native American languages, including Hawaiian. There will be, we believe, a significant grant program for college retention and completion, significant institutional aid for minority serving institutions. All 10 of our campuses are formally classified as such. There will also likely be particular grants for students from the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands to attend out-of-state 4-year public institutions. We think we can attract a fair number of those to Hawaii, given our affinity with them. Lots of funding for energy and commerce and medicine that we think will be competitive for, again, playing on underserved areas and medical service for minority populations, investments in natural resources, research, education, job training, technical assistance in areas like coastal communities and community and climate resilience. Again, as an island state, we have a lot of coastline, water resources, and climate adaptation, where UH is exceptionally strong. Investments in science, space, and technology, where we are strong, and environmental justice, pathways to practice. We are hoping for help on graduate medical education, aka residencies, which are really important to building our doctor workforce. And right now, there's still a program for public university research infrastructure. So all of that looks really good, assuming that Build Back Better bill makes it through. The last of the 3 bills I want to mention is the federal budget bill. So if you're tracking these things, the federal fiscal year ended September 30, so there is no budget for the current fiscal year at all. They have continued on with what's called a continuing resolution, where essentially what was funded last year continues to be funded. That runs until mid-December, and at this point, it does not look like there will be a new budget by mid-December, so that's likely to be extended, we think, now until February. There is really good support for a number of programs in the current drafts. I don't think it's worth our time to go through those now. We'll keep you updated. If you are interested, we've got a summary of what we are trying to accomplish. But let me just thank Vice President Sirmos and Dr. Amy Grace. Many of you have met when she's talked with us about our U Healthy program. She also serves as our primary staffer in federal relations, working with all of our congressional offices, the University of Alaska, and others. Next, I want to comment on the status of the comprehensive plan to achieve a reimagined University of Hawaiʻi, or the Reimagining project. In July, I presented a status report on our work to reimagine UH to meet the needs of the state in the new environment post-pandemic. This highlighted the priorities we have identified and that the board embraced in the budget policy paper to help the state recover and move toward a more sustainable and abundant future for all. That presentation also laid out our challenging financial realities, which are currently mitigated by a significant amount of one-time funding, including the substantial federal support we received both directly and through the state of Hawaii. And in July, I also laid out an approach to implementation involving much more careful management of all our resources, strengthening our revenue sources beyond state funding, and leveraging our capabilities across the system in a tighter and more intentional manner. That approach was dubbed 1UH, as suggested in the third decade report that our consultants helped us with. We received feedback from the board in July. The officers have met together in a mini retreat format to review that feedback from the board and from others as we continue that work. I will say that one outcome so far is that pretty much nobody other than me liked the term 1UH. So we are pivoting away from that. I will say 1UH was perceived, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, to be like the Borg assimilating our campuses, more than a collaboration. So we have a revised working title right now, UH United. Suggestions welcome. Maybe we'll give prizes. But UH United, we think, carries more of the intent that all of our parts of UH are distinct, and there are good reasons that our parts are distinct, and our communities have different needs. What we must commit to is to work much more closely together to leverage all of our UH assets and capabilities wherever they may be across the islands, to serve the needs of our entire population across the islands. So every campus shouldn't have to meet the needs of its community on its own. That's really the principle we're trying to achieve. And again, technology is a big part of how we can do that and the lessons we have learned through this pandemic. At the same time, our work on reimagining is taking place in response to the pandemic. We also noticed that we have reached the end of the stated term of our current strategic directions. These were adopted by the board in 2015. This is our version of a strategic plan, and these were updated just three years ago based on what had been happening in the first 3 years. So we want to make sure we're thinking about these two planning efforts together. Our thinking is that the tenets of the Reimagining project, which are really about the changes we need to make based on the pandemic, those have to be embedded in our long-term strategic directions or strategic plan as well, rather than sit alone as a standalone report. And this is actually similar to the approach that we took with the Integrated Academic and Facilities Plan, or IAFP. It was initially developed as a standalone document, and we are now moving all of the concerns that it was intended to address and its tenets into permanent Board of Regents policies. So that work on reimagining is actively underway. I appreciate the patience of the board, and we will provide a more complete update on this work as a fully noticed agenda item in January with information in advance of the meeting. We will also be publicly launching our next strategic planning effort after the holidays in January. We expect that to be roughly a one-year project with the goal of bringing a new set of strategic directions back to the board before the end of calendar 2022. That plan will both utilize the input of the third decade study or project, and it will also bring the tenets of reimagining as imperatives back into our strategic plan for the next 6-year period. Just a few tidbits on some other matters before we turn it over for our campus report. First, quick update on philanthropy. As of yesterday, we were at $46 million in philanthropic gifts for this fiscal year. Last year, we were at $43 million on the same day. Congratulations to Vice President Dolan and team. That's $3 million up, and we've got some good stuff in the pipeline as well. I will also note that last year, we modernized the agreement between the UH Foundation and the University of Hawaiʻi. At the time you approved that, you also gave me approval to renew that as long as there were no major changes. So I do want to let you know, because that was a one-year contract, we did not identify any major changes needed during that first year that we're just winding up now. So we have renewed it once again with no significant changes, this time for a 3-year period. This is really a longstanding contract that's been in place for decades, and we will continue to tweak and tune it as we go. Secondly, let me mention our research dollars. I hate to say this, but we're actually $3 million down year over year, but we're still in a very good place, 262 million as compared to 265. Our total outside funding, if you put these together, is just about flat, a little over $300 million so far this fiscal year from other sources. I mean, we forget sometimes how much we bring into this economy through our other work. Most of you are probably following the COP Committee of Participants in Glasgow. This is the UN Climate Change Conference. This is a high priority for Hawaii and for UH, and we were there in force. Governor Ige has just returned, making a number of presentations. I want to highlight the participation of many of our UH students and faculty from across multiple units. SOEST, Law, Social Sciences in particular, attended, participated, and spoke. And Provost Bruno, who in his spare time applies his expertise in ocean observation systems, climate change, and community resilience. He participated in several COP-related panels. His participation was virtual. Lastly, let me mention some of our national winners over the past month. Our UH entomology team, you probably didn't know we had one, Team Kamea Kolo, won the national championships in the entomology games at the Entomological Society of America national meeting in Denver. In taking first place for the country, they beat giants and past champions who, particularly UC Riverside and Texas A&M, pretty convincingly. So congratulations to the team out of our Department of Plant and Environmental Protection Sciences in CTAR, and their advisor is Professor Mark Wright in that department. Secondly, I want to mention the Meteor Hackathon, sponsored by a software company, another national hackathon last month, challenged teams to build impactful applications for a cause. UH Manoa teams from our computer science department took both first place and third place. Our first place team was Eco Camino, an application designed to support the organization of sustainability-related events like cleanups and workshops. And our third place team was Kokoa, an application to support the organization of safe face-to-face meetings during the pandemic. All of our students were participating in this hackathon as part of an ICS special topics course taught by Professor Philip Johnson in information and computer science. Our esports program won its first national championship last month in Valorant, one of the more popular esports games. And we compete in the Mountain West Esports Conference in 6 different games. And right now, we are one of only 10 finalists nationally. And esports programs exist now at almost every university in the country. We're one of 10 competing to be recognized on Saturday as the best esports program in the country. I lived outside Chicago for a while, so I encourage you all to go online, vote early, and vote often. And lastly, let me mention a team of scientists from multiple UH community colleges took first place in a rocketry competition. We excel at this. This was in Nevada in September. And our Project Imua, a longstanding program that brings together participants from multiple campuses and the UH Manoa College of Engineering. Team 9 won the Extreme Altitude Hybrid Competition with the launch of our 12-foot, 8-inch hybrid rocket. Since that program is largely homed at Windward Community College, it's a great time for me to turn it over to Chancellor Eschenberg, our virtual host for the day. Artists.